So welcome to our second keynote for the conference, and I'm very glad to have Noam Elcott for it. And this is also the closing session for our conference. It was a long week, as many of you kept on connecting. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here tonight as well, or today, whatever time is the time you're in. And Noam's talk is titled La Nuit américaine, Artificial Darkness and Race in Recent American Art. Noam is Associate Professor for the History of Modern Art and Director of the Center for Comparative Media at Columbia University. He's also the editor of the journal Grey Room and the author of the award-winning book Artificial Darkness, An Obscure History of Modern Art and Media, published in 2016, as well as essays on art, film, media, published in leading journals, anthologies, and exhibition catalogues. His current book projects are ArtTM, A History of Modern Art, Authenticity and Trademarks, and Photography, Identity, Status, August Sanders, People of the 20th Century. So I'm very happy to have you here. Thank you again for your availability, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you for the introduction and for moderating the discussion to come. Thanks to all the organizers for the rich and impressive conference. I'm delighted to be here, albeit virtually. And my paper has 4 sections, should run about 35 minutes. It focuses on art, but touches occasionally on American popular culture, new and old. I'll get right to it. White picket fences, wide open fields, gnarled thickets, reflections of trees and sky, forests, the choppy surface of a lake. When encountered in its original exhibition context, St. John's Episcopal Church in Cleveland, as part of Front International, the 2018 Cleveland Triennial for Contemporary Art, the arc of this obscure landscape photography project would not have been hard to discern. Before the end of American slavery, St. John's Episcopal Church in Cleveland was known to some as Station Hope, the penultimate stop on one route of the Underground Railroad, a covert network of safe houses and churches that shepherded African Americans from slavery in the South to freedom north of the Canadian border. The images, made by photographer Dawoud Bey in 2017 and first exhibited the following year, trace an imagined 19th century journey from slavery to freedom. The photographs, according to Bey, I quote, are intended to evoke the sensory and spatial experience of fugitive slaves moving through the darkness of pre-Civil War Ohio landscape, an enveloping darkness that was a passage to liberation. Bey was forced to imagine the journey as the precise routes and sites comprising the Underground Railroad were, by necessity, secret. Unmarked and unmonumental, they remain largely unmemorialized, as curators Corey Keller and Elizabeth Sherman recently noted. The large format landscape photographs are thus simultaneously polemical and elusive. In these Ohio nocturnes, there are no clear lines dividing collective guilt from individual redemption, terror from beauty, the sublime from the picturesque. The message, in so much as one can reduce complex work to simple messages, appears to be that the American landscape is forever tinged by the original sin of slavery. This much is straightforward enough. But Dawoud Bey is, among other things, a consummate formalist and technician. Simple political messages, unmoored from the particularities of the photographic medium, hold no truck for a photographer of Bey's sophistication. And so we have to look more closely. A first clue can be found in the work's collective title, Night Coming Tenderly, Black. The title derives from Langston Hughes' poem Dream Variations, first published in 1926. It is short enough to recite in full. To fling my arms wide in some place of the sun, to whirl and to dance till the white day is done, then rest at a cool evening beneath a tall tree, while night comes on gently, dark like me. That is my dream. To fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, dance, whirl, whirl, till the quick day is done, rest at a pale evening, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me. Hughes's smooth rhymes and softly staccato rhymes belie a profound reversal. He longs not for sunlight, visibility, and fame, but rather for night, invisibility, and obscurity. The final lines, cited only fragmentarily by Bey, speak to the cloak of darkness afforded African Americans after sunset. Night coming tenderly, black like me. Night's cloak of darkness afforded enslaved Black Americans the chance to escape their enslavement. Darkness and night were the rails on which the Underground Railroad was conducted. But the night captured by Bey in these landscapes is not like all other nights. Bey regularly evokes the influence of Roy DeCarava, the preeminent mid-century photographer of American Blackness, understood in terms of both race and photographic technique. As Bey reflected in a recent interview, DeCarava's work was formative, he says, was formative to my own thinking early on, and these dark landscapes are a kind of material conversation with his work, using the darkness of the landscape and the photographic print as an evocative space of blackness through which the unseen and imaginary Black fugitive subject is moving. The material conversation with DeCarava is evident as soon as we recognize that these photographs were taken not at night, but during the day. These are not traditional photographic nocturnes so much as darkroom constructions. Their darkness is not natural, rather it is artificial, technologized darkness. Like DeCarava before him, Bey printed these photographs dark. Whites turn silver or slate, midtones a crepuscular black, and blacks a luxurious range of velvets boring holes in the surface of the image. Bey's prime reference is surely DeCarava, who famously produced The Sweet Fly Paper of Life, a book of shadowy, radiant photographs with an accompanying text by Langston Hughes. But I suspect another reference lurks. The photographic and, more famously, cinematic technique employed by Bey is called day for night. Through the use of filters, darkroom techniques, or a combination thereof, scenes that could not readily be shot at night are shot in the day and processed to appear as if they took place at night. Such explicit use of day for night was long out of fashion when Bey embarked on the series. But an echo of the day for night technique would have resounded in art world ears as the 2006 Whitney Biennial, curated by the Englishwoman Chrissy Isles and the Frenchman Philippe Van, was titled Day for Night. Isles and Van borrowed the American title of Truffaut's 1973 Oscar-winning film as the title of their own survey of contemporary American art in the age of American decline. Afghanistan, Iraq, Abu Ghraib, black sites, torture, corruption, lies without end. Day for Night was the official title of the biennial, but as everyone knew, the real reference was to Truffaut's original French title and the eponymous cinematographic technique. Not Day for Night, but rather La Nuit américaine, the American night. That's the name of the original technique in France and of Truffaut's original French title, La Nuit américaine. In a single stroke, Bey captures two essential features of the American night: its technologized artificiality and its nebulous yet lethal racism. Like a product of nature, less a product of nature than of darkroom techniques and historical oppression, Bey's nocturnes are the essential gateway to rethink the relationship between artificial darkness and race in recent American art. But before we proceed, we must take one or two steps back to rehearse the history of artificial darkness more broadly and its imbrications with racism, American and French. Metaphoric darkness was the enemy against which the Enlightenment fancied its forward march. But nascent technologies of light and darkness regularly operationalized Enlightenment ideals toward oppressive ends. Exemplary was the Panopticon, envisioned by Jeremy Bentham, for whom a dark dungeon was instrumentally inferior to a well-lit inspection house. The Panopticon perfectly blended Enlightenment ideals and disciplinary power, with light serving both ends at once. In Foucault's famous account, the panoptic mechanism arranges spatial unities that make it possible to see constantly and to recognize immediately. In short, it reverses the principle of the dungeon. Full lighting and the eye of a superior capture better than darkness, which ultimately protected. Visibility is a trap. Bentham would not theorize the panopticon until the end of the 18th century. The first panopticon proper would not be built until the early 19th century. But the impulse to discipline through light was long developed, not least against Black and other oppressed bodies. In March 1713, the Common Council of New York City passed a law for regulating, I'm quoting, a law for regulating Negro and Indian slaves in the nighttime that declared, quote, no Negro or Indian slave above the age of 14 years do presume to be or appear in any of the streets of New York City in the nighttime above 1 hour after sunset without a lantern and a lighted candle. The law was enacted 1 year after a revolt by enslaved people. The threat of insurrection was its immediate concern, but more was at stake than law and order. The law for regulating Negro and Indian slaves in the nighttime attacked the possibilities of independence afforded by darkness. As A.B. Huber has eloquently argued, those enacting and enforcing the law understood these as intolerable intimacies with freedom, fugitive forms of deliverance abetted by the absence of light, and they sought to limn the racial boundary with lantern light. A candle may seem to be a weak tool of domination, but its pale light was not meant to master the night's vast darkness. It was meant to further expose vulnerable bodies and to eclipse forms of freedom and movement that threatened white supremacy. The desire to discipline darkness, nocturnal and racial, through enlightened technology was hardly limited to the 18th century. Indeed, in many respects, it has only become more nuanced and pervasive in the intervening centuries. Where the late 19th century breaks with its predecessors is not in the use of light to oppress the dark, but in the technologization of darkness toward the same end. Photographic darkrooms, darkened theaters and cinemas, and scientific and popular uses of the black screen, more on this shortly, all required highly controlled technologized darkness, a condition I have termed artificial darkness. Its popularization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was decisively tied to race. More precisely, the conjunction of artificial darkness and race was a joke, a racist joke. The joke was told notoriously by the poet Paul Bilhau, a member of Les Arts Incohérents, the incoherent arts, a satirical art movement now most famous for its anticipation of sundry avant-garde techniques, not least monochrome painting. On August 2nd, 1882, Jules Lévy organized the first presentation of the Incoherents, followed 2 months later by an exhibition at his Parisian home. Infamously, Lévy exhibited a black monochrome by Bilhau titled Negroes Fighting in a Tunnel. The French writer and humorist Alphonse Allais elaborated on the conceit with first communion of choratic young girls in the snow, all white, apoplectic cardinals harvesting tomatoes on the shore of the Red Sea, a red monochrome, Negroes fighting in a tunnel by night, a black monochrome, and other monochromes dutifully collected in his April Foolish album, Album Primo Avrilisque, a portfolio of 7 monochromatic images and more and less racist titles published by Paul Ollendorff in 1897. Racism was a mainstay of this line of humor. Technologized darkness was not. That changed when Emil Cole, a father of cinematic animation and one-time incoherent artist, brought the gag to the screen for the French film studio Gaumont in the summer of 1910. I'll play a 1-minute excerpt with a contemporary soundtrack. Here are Negroes in a tunnel at night. Titled The Neo-Impressionist Painter, but clearly derived from the incoherent arts, the film depicts an artist in a studio visited by an eager bourgeois collector. The artist presents one monochrome after another. Intertitles announce their content. For example, a cardinal eating lobster and tomatoes on the shore of the Red Sea, whereupon the film cuts to a red-tinted animation in which appear said cardinal lobster, tomatoes, and seashore. The gag is reprised with a Chinaman transporting corn on the Yellow River, a Pierrot on the pile of snow, and so forth, such that frequently racist intertitles precede tinted sequences of animated line drawings. The collector becomes progressively more agitated until a black monochrome sends him into a buying frenzy. The black monochrome, we are told, represents Negroes making shoe polish in a tunnel at night. The film cuts to black leader, that is, opaque black film that impedes all light, and in contradistinction to every other sequence, begets no animation. The screen and the auditorium remain a uniform black. Bilhau, Allais, and Cole portion their wit from the same commonplace stew as Hegel, who famously condemned the formalism of Friedrich Schelling and others as that undifferentiated night in which, as we say, all cows are black. Hegel's jibe helps us distinguish Bilhau's original joke from the elaborations proffered by Alphonse Allais, a distinction articulated clearly in the film by Emil Cole. Whereas all the objects in a red monochrome must be red, cardinals, tomatoes, and so forth, all cows need not, indeed must not, be black. Red is a color. Darkness, the physical absence of light, is an environmental condition. In Cole's film, the red monochrome sequence comprises hand-drawn animations tinted red. In the green monochrome sequence, the animation is tinted green, and so forth. That is, all but one monochrome in Cole's film are represented as discernible animated content tinted the appropriate colors. Only his black monochrome completely negates the image, plunges the auditorium in darkness, and turns its rows of spectators into a darkling plain of black cows. That condition, that darkness is a condition as such as, or more than, it is a color, was too obvious to garner mention. No less natural, that is, ideological as Barthes properly understood it, was the absolute identity of darkness and race. A second story, among the foundational myths of technologized darkness in the late 19th century, repeats the toxic and wholly naturalized mix of Orientalism, race, and controlled darkness. It revolves around the magic act and stage technique known as black art, which helped promulgate the black screen as a media technology that would eventually yield the blue and green screen technologies of today. In the early 1880s, during an engagement with the National Theater in Berlin, Max Autzinger played character parts and served as stage manager. A certain scene depicted a farmer who cast his daughter Lucy into a dark prison, which Autzinger draped in black velvet. Autzinger expected applause when the valiant Negro appeared in the window of the prison to rescue Lucy, but he heard nothing, and he saw, in place of a white actor in blackface, only a row of shining white teeth. The rescue of Lucy by the invisible Negro caused such a stir that Autzinger went about devising black art. The incoherent artist Paul Bilhau and Emil Cole reduced the Negro in the dark to a sight gag. But whereas Bilhau and Cole saw a joke, Autzinger saw an opportunity. The basic arrangement that undergirded black art was nearly identical to that which underpinned media dispositives like Pepper's Ghost and Etienne Jules Marais' chronophotography. By the turn of the century, the details of the technique were an open trade secret. Quote, everything is performed in a dark chamber, draped entirely in black. The hall is placed almost in darkness, the only lights being a set of side lights and footlights, which are turned toward the audience with reflectors behind, making it impossible for eyes to penetrate into the darkness beyond them. Everything used in the chamber is white, even the performer's dress, forming a contrast necessary to the illusion. Before the black screen, anyone or anything draped in black velvet would vanish before the black screen. Black-clad assistants could work inconspicuously in the darkness. Objects, even body parts, could be made to appear or disappear with the elimination or introduction of a black covering. This was the technical core of black art, and an essential technical element of artificial darkness. But technique alone makes for incomplete magic theater. The artificial darkness produced by the velvet light traps known as l'écran noir, the black screen, was mobilized by scientists such as Marais, magicians such as Autzinger, film pioneers such as Méliès, and Hollywood directors such as James Whale in his 1933 film version of H.G. Wells's The Invisible Man, starring Claude Rains. These technical ensembles seem free of racism that tinged the jokes of Bilhau, Allais, and Cole, but they are not. A technical history of artificial darkness could dismiss the repeated recourse to race and racism without sacrificing its technical precision. But technique alone makes for incomplete history. As Peter Gallison has argued in a different context, quote, in general, the cultural meaning of concepts or practices is indissolubly tied to their genealogy. The genealogy of artificial darkness is mired in racist rhetoric. And so it reared its ugly head in the seemingly pure painting that dominated much of the earliest 20th century avant-garde imagination, including Kazimir Malevich's Black Square from 1915. Malevich's ponderous emblem of suprematism meant many things to many people, but it is hardly happenstance that scholars recently unearthed, scrawled on the paint by an uncertain hand, the words, quote, a battle of Negroes. It is an unwelcome but unavoidable legacy for contemporary artists. Nomen est omen. Cobain Mercer has characterized the 20th century as one, quote, that saw gradual shifts in the symbolic power of the proper name, from Negro through colored to black. Few artists have been more attentive to the overlaps and slippages between racial and visual blackness than Kerry James Marshall. For Marshall, the most lauded living African-American painter, blackness is inextricably bound up in with invisibility. As Ralph Ellison declared in the opening pages of his epic-making novel, Invisible Man, quote, "Before that, I lived in the darkness into which I was chased, but now I see. I've illuminated the blackness of my invisibility, and vice versa." Marshall's darkness is not the technologized invisibility espoused by Wells, Rains, and others. It is closely tied to the materials and craft of painting. Inspired by Ellison, Marshall abandoned the abstract collage and painting practice that preoccupied him since art school and set down the path of figurative painting, laser focused on making visible the invisibility of African Americans. His breakthrough painting was a portrait of the artist as a shadow of his former self from 1980. Its lineage in the racist jokes and artificial darkness of the late 19th century is immediately apparent today and seems to have been recognized, albeit negatively, by Marshall. Quote, "I thought there might be a visual way of representing that same condition of invisibility, which was not the total transparency described by H.G. Wells in his novel, The Invisible Man, nor a scene in the Claude Rains movie where he takes off his clothes and just vanishes. Ellison described a psychological and perceptual invisibility that is conditioned by the political and social realities of America, rather than by any particular lack of density. A portrait of the artist has that toothy grin. Around then, I started reading about folklore. I had always heard jokes about blackness, because even in the Black community, blackness was a state or condition for derision, a negative state. Back then, calling somebody black could get you beat up. There were sayings, don't marry anybody blacker than you, and jokes about people being so dark you can't see them at night unless they're smiling. Folk humor and folklore. Marshall's portrait of the artist as a shadow of his former self and the series of Invisible Man paintings that followed gather up a century of racist jokes by Bilhoud and Allais and whoever scrawled on Malevich's black square, along with the technologized artificial darkness of Marais and his chronophotography, Méliès and his stage and cinematic magic, and Claude Rains and his star turn as the Invisible Man. Marshall gathers up these entangled and often objectionable traditions to combat with grace and beauty, ferocity and wit, the, quote, psychological and perceptual invisibility of Black people that is conditioned by the political and social realities of America. Marshall attends to the technologies and techniques of darkness specific to painting, especially as they relate to the realities of Black skin. As Lanka Tattersall has argued, quote, there are 3 Blacks in Kerry James Marshall's paintings. Their names are Ivory, Mars, and Carbon. The figures in the majority of Marshall's paintings are not various shades of umber, ochre, and sienna, pigments that more accurately match the skin tones of people of color. Marshall's bodies are literally Black. Outsinger's apocryphal tale of the valiant come invisible Negro fails not least because Black skin, the actual skin tones of people of African descent, is no substitute for the absolute Black bodysuits of Black art assistants. Absolute artificial darkness and racial Blackness are resolutely distinct. Outsinger conflated the two in order to produce an origin story for Black art as a technology of invisibility. Marshall substitutes literal Black for Black skin tones in order to render the invisibility of Blacks in American society and in the history of art. Switching to a more popular culture note, Lizzo, the African-American body-positive pop star, channeled the whole of this history as well in what could reasonably be described as a piece of pop culture performance art at the 2019 MTV Music Awards and on the social media platform then known as Twitter. Sporting a chroma key green dress or bodysuit, she effectively invited her fans to erase or replace her body, and they lovingly obliged. The same dynamic is in evidence in Double, Quadruple, etc., 1 and 2, a hauntingly beautiful video piece by artist Sandra Perry. Here, videos of ecstatic dancers in the studio are run through Photoshop using the content-aware function in order to erase their bodies. Made in 2013, the piece sounded the alarm of digital disappearance in the era of artificial intelligence. As she has said, quote, "The preoccupations of my work are around technologies of representation, technologies of lenses, surveillance, and how Blackness and Black culture show up in those spaces, how they navigate, how they explode representation altogether." A final example, and with this I'll conclude. A recent piece by Kerry May Weems ventures a direct confrontation between technologies of artificial darkness and the racist tropes with which they have intersected. Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me, a story in 5 parts from 2012, is an intricate work that revisits thematically and technologically American slavery and its legacy. The 18.5-minute video installation is one of many recent works in art, theater, and popular culture to resurrect the 19th century optical attraction called Pepper's Ghost, using contemporary materials such as mylar and technologies such as video projection. Commonly and erroneously called holograms, Pepper's Ghost installations have conjured the ghosts of Tupac Shakur at Coachella in 2012, Michael Jackson at the Billboard Music Awards in 2014, and in a much more somber tone, enslaved African Americans at the Legacy Museum from enslavement to mass incarceration in Montgomery, Alabama, which opened its doors in April 2018. The setup is simple and has remained consistent since the 1860s. A slanted transparent surface, originally glass, now mylar, is placed between the stage and the audience so that off-stage actors or video can be superimposed onto the set. Crucially, and here is where artificial darkness first consolidated as an entertainment technology, virtual reflected actors or videos only gain solidity if they and their reflection in the glass screen are backed by absolutely black backgrounds. Weems marshals this technology to visualize ghosts and to combat them. In Weems's installation, the red curtains are real, as is the velvet red rope that separates viewers from the illusion. But all the figures are projected onto an invisible screen between the red curtain stage and the audience, just as in any other Pepper's Ghost illusion. Lincoln, Lonnie, and Mir appears to be structured around a perfect coincidence and an essential difference. The coincidence: Pepper's Ghost premiered in 1863, the same year Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, which features prominently in the Weems work. Weems declaims the line from the address with her own inimitable intonations, cadences, and repetitions as several ghostly figures, including Abraham Lincoln, barely visible in his black-on-black frock coat vest, trousers, and stovepipe hat, appears from and disappears into the darkness. The difference is what separates the absolute black necessary for Pepper's Ghost illusion to succeed and the dark, but hardly absolute black skin tones of the African American performers in Weems's piece. That difference, as we know, is what gives the lie to Outsinger's apocryphal origin story for Black art and provides the catalyst for Kerry James Marshall literally black figures. The piece opens with an early 20th century hymn by the African American gospel blues singer, guitarist, and evangelist, Blind Willie Johnson. An African American tap dancer appears in a black suit and top hat. The only bright whites visible are the triangle of shirt not covered by the double-breasted jacket, the tip of his cuffs, the whites of his eyes, and his toothy smile. In the hands of Billhauer Outsinger, we would have the making of yet another racist joke abetted by black screen technologies. But Weems is no 19th century white entertainer. Indeed, it is precisely this tradition she interrogates. Black screens were almost always an all or nothing affair. White costumes were visible, black cloaks rendered their contents invisible. Cover a head in a black velvet bag, and the results were the magical decapitations executed by Outzinger, Melius, and before them, Pepper's Ghost performers. Efficacious phantasmagoric presence, such as Tupac at Coachella, requires, in the 19th century, like today, a perfectly dark background. Weems does not deal in efficacious tricks any more than she trades in racist jokes. In 1863, the African-American tap dancer may have been forced to perform in one of those more mundane displays of power in which it is difficult to discern domination from recreation, as Saidiya Hartman has argued. Quote, behind the facade of innocent amusements lay the violence of Behind the facade of innocent amusements lay the violence the master class assiduously denied. But what else could jigs, dance, and command performances be but the gentle indices of domination? Decisively, the tap dancer routine flouts every convention of Pepper's Ghost, destroying the illusion even as it engenders a spectral presence. The dancer's image will not be contained within the black ground, and instead regularly passes over the red curtain, losing its semblance of solidity and presence. More to the point, his black suit and black skin are often illuminated in strong, raking light that similarly undermines the illusion and rebuffs the dicta established by Wilhelm Outzinger for cheap, racist laughs. Pepper's Ghost, like chronophotography, black art, and diverse black screens, operates in binaries, invisible black and visible white. Weems's installation modulates the many physical shades and historical resonances of darkness. As an illusion, Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me regularly falters and thus generally fails to convince. For Weems, darkness is not an optical illusion. Quite the contrary. Lincoln, Lonnie, and Me succeeds precisely in its insistence that artificial darkness and race cannot be separated, neither from each other nor from history. And its capacity to make that history uncannily present, disquietingly spectral, and pulsing with righteous anger and jubilant abandon. This righteous jubilation unfolds against the slide guitar of blind Willie Johnson. The name of this tune, Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground. This is the ultimate American nocturne, artificial, violent, and yet hopeful. This is La Nuit américaine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much for the presentation for a start. And I'm going to open the floor to questions, and I'm sure that some of you will have questions because you really touched upon quite a few topics that we saw throughout the week from different speakers. So please, if you have any questions, as you know, raise your hand with a button, write them in the chat if you want. And I don't know, I can break the ice while somebody thinks of something to ask to you. I was, when you were talking about the erasure of the body in Lizzo and Sandra Perry, I was reminded of a discussion that we had yesterday in a panel that came out of a speaker's presentation about Grace Jones's Corporate Cannibal music video. There is a video in which she basically it's black and white and she gets deformed. So when you were talking about digital disappearance, I was just thinking of how the human shape of the body disappears in a way in this black and white play, and it's distorted and manipulated. So how is the corporeality in digital bodies? Is there, can we talk about the corporeality of these bodies, even if they get erased, but we still can see them in their invisibility? So I don't know if it makes sense, but I was just, since I was looking at what you were showing, especially the Sandra Perry images, that we still can tell that there is a body, even though it is erased and invisible in a way.
Yeah, great question and very appropriate. The three quick thoughts. First is, Zoom may be the perfect medium for this. We've all encountered various digital backgrounds in Zoom, and depending on the movement, sometimes people disappear into that background. So we're all now familiar with that collapse of corporeality, digital bodies, and digital backgrounds, affecting some of the same slippages that we're seeing in the art and popular culture that I pointed to in this talk. So what was once a very select, obscure phenomenon really was generalized during lockdown and COVID, when we were all functioning almost exclusively on Zoom, and as is present today, continue to function often on Zoom. The second thought is the strange phenomenon that we're seeing with a lot of AI, generative AI, in which especially faces aren't always fully rendered. And so there is within these digital bodies a certain slippage, a certain obscurity, a certain invisibility that is also being affected, with which we have to regularly engage. And the now enormous amounts of research on the hardwired racism of many of these generative AI programs. So these things are we might say that the 19th and 20th century iterations of conflations of technology and racism and invisibility were things like the black screen and these Pepper's ghost and phantasmagoric techniques. In the 21st century, it looks to be AI. The third comment I want to make is that in much of the work, in much of this history, in much of the work, being invisible wasn't a bad thing. Being invisible meant safety, meant freedom, meant the possibility of escaping oppression. And we're so consumed with the visibility and corporeality that we sometimes forget that invisibility and incorporeality is vastly more important. In our surveillant and data-valent age, that invisibility is harder and harder to achieve, and something that we might want to aspire to rather than assume is negative.
Yeah, I think actually right before this keynote, we had a panel that was about surveillance indeed, and how you can either hide or be protected or instrumentalize darkness or being in the dark. So I'm wondering then, since in the beginning, as you were drawing this history in a way of how light has been instrumentalized, as the Panopticon is this putting the light and exposing the Black body and exposing bodies that were anyway, discriminated and abject in a way and grotesque, because you had to expose them to show that whiteness was better than that. So I really like what you were saying, that disability is a trap.
Yeah, I mean, In all fairness, that was Michel Foucault. I
Yeah,
just
yeah,
quoted
yeah.
it,
But you were drawing on that to give us an idea of how dark can afford something that not necessarily you can get in any other way. And I was just wondering, do you think, I don't know, is this still possible? Because as you were saying, in this day and age, it's so hard to not be visible in a way. So is there some other kind of uh, darkness that can be instrumentalized to be protected, to be safe, to be independent? And I don't know, I'm just wondering, maybe in some way social media or something, is there a place that is still in the dark? Do
yeah,
you think so?
it's a wonderful question. A few reflections. One, on social media, I'm probably not your man, given that I'm not on social media. So my best tip for not being surveyed on social media is don't be on social media. My own scholarship tends to be more historical, so I absolutely document some places and practices of protective obscurity, of potential of obscurity, of darkness that can release all kinds of Dionysian pleasures and rejections of oppression. In the book that you mentioned in your introduction, Artificial Darkness, an obscure history of modern art and media. So that would be a place to look. And a third thought, a very exciting upcoming exhibition at the Guggenheim, which opens in October, is called Going Dark, the Contemporary Figure at the Edge of Visibility. And I don't know the precise works in the exhibition, but many of the artists in the exhibition are the same artists that I presented today. And I would suspect it's some of the same works, but it's impossible, of course, for me to know. And that is probably going to be an exhibition full of darknesses that are liberatory and that push back against both surveillance and racism in very compelling ways. So it's an exhibition that I, and I think many others, are very much looking forward to.
I mean, it sounds like a very, very intriguing exhibition, absolutely. So we do have two questions. Laura, if you want to go first.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for such an interesting talk. In the beginning, so for the first 10 minutes or 15 minutes of your talk, I was very keen on asking you about Carrie Mae Wims, but you did end up talking about her. So I'm gonna change my question, and I was thinking about Cara Walker, and the shadow puppets and that connection to African American history and the oral tradition and the way she uses that art, and shadow puppetry in general, I guess, which also came out during our conference in a talk about Candyman, the last Candyman, which uses this shadow puppet in the movie to talk about dark times of slavery and stories and that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, Cara Walker's such a remarkable artist and with such a huge reception. The few comments I would add, and other scholars have noted actually as well, is the degree to which she's also dipping into a whole range of specifically 19th century popular attractions. So if you look at her work, it doesn't only reference the history of art and the history of racism, but it also looks at 19th century popular culture as a new avenue for artistic expression. And I don't think we fully understand her work until we run it through the long history of popular culture and popular amusements and recognize that while these are images would never have been produced in the 19th century, she's often adopting and repurposing precisely the technologies like shadow puppetry and silhouettes and various round, cycloramas, or what they're called, and other popular attractions that in other variations would have been common for certain 19th century audiences. So there's, like the work that I referenced, and she could have been part of this as well, very much so, but like a lot of the work that I discussed today, the reference is not only to the long history of art, but it's also to the long history of popular culture. And there's something, to me, incredibly powerful about running this art history through 19th and 20th century popular culture to make it both real and alive, but also untimely. So it's not merely mirroring back our own society to ourselves, but running it through its long history, high art and popular culture both.
Thank you very much.
And I think, yes, we had another question.
Hi. Thanks for this. This was great. I think I'll in particular be haunted by Kerry James Marshall's Portrait of the Artist as a shadow of his former self, because I hadn't seen that painting before, or art piece. Which also made me think in a certain way, this is going to be the first question in a certain way, even though this might not be super academic, if you will. Made me think of Sean Cubitt's, if you know that, discussion about the blackness of film in particular, and how that differs from the blackness of painting in particular. That painting cannot achieve the blackness that you have in particular in digital film in particular. The sort of attempt to sort of represent darkness without being really able to represent real blackness in charcoal in particular. Which had me wondering, and as I was saying, this is not highly academic, but since you also delved into popular culture, this larger question of the darkness, of the use of darkness in contemporary television in particular, where, there's this constant discussion as to why series are dark, why these dark aesthetics are usually also connected to notions of quality in a certain way, or artness in some way or another. So if you want to comment on that, this sort of darkness of contemporary television. And the second question, if I might just add that, is a kind of historical question, whether you might be able to place a kind of starting point or origin of artificial darkness and its sort of connection to race. It had me thinking of the Chicago World's Fair, but it probably started way earlier than that, in how during the Chicago World's Fair, you had light in the center and the margins were dark, where apparently also illegal activities were going on, and you had H.H. Holmes then outside of the fair itself. So yeah, these two questions, if you want to comment on that.
The historical one I dealt with at length, so I can tackle first. In the book Artificial Darkness, I argue that the history kind of begins with the phantasmagoria at the end of the 18th century, but it doesn't, like the full-blown artificial darkness, this controlled, technologized darkness, doesn't. And then it also is further strengthened in the photographic darkroom, because in the photographic darkroom we have a darkness that's dark not to human eyes, because you have a ruby red lamp on, but it is dark to the chemistry. So it's a obscurité chimique, as they say in the various manuals. It's a chemical darkness, but not a human darkness. So this is already forms of darkness that are non-human. But really, I argue that it gets going in Pepper's Ghost in the 1860s. And Pepper's Ghost consolidates all the crucial ingredients, and then Marais with the black screen just perfects it. And it's Marais' black screen. This sounds ridiculous, but there's a direct lineage from Marais' black screen to various colored screen technologies in like yellow screen in the 1920s. And then finally to the blue and green screen technologies of chroma key. So that is a very direct and explicit lineage. Obviously, the technology changes dramatically, but the lineage is 100% there. Regarding the question of television and I think I understood the question, but if I didn't, please jump in again. For a period, and I was following this very closely for a while and haven't in recent years, but for a while, all TVs had like the same resolution. They were all super bright. They all had like great internet connectivity, et cetera. And one of the features that that companies used to distinguish their high-end TVs from other high-end TVs was the quality of the blackness, of the darkness, of true blacks. And when I last checked, OLEDs were triumphant in this regard, and I think to the present they're still considered the best TV screens precisely because of the quality of the darkness. So it is an interesting phenomenon, and we've all experienced it in classrooms or wherever, where the projector doesn't produce, the digital projector doesn't produce anything resembling real black. I mean, there's such a huge difference between real black and cinematic black, right, versus digital black. These OLED screens, which, as part of my research, I went to a shopping mall and went to a TV store just to check this out. And these TVs are pretty impressive. So it was fascinating to me that this would become the defining feature of high-end television, would be darkness. That is a turn I definitely was not expecting.
Thank you.
And we have a question by Stephanie.
Yes, hello. There we go. Oops. Hi there. Yes, I thank you for your presentation. I was so struck of a few elements really about animation versus de-animation in what you presented, and I thought it was so interesting, the kind of black square, the kind of film, but also the kind of black box where the audience is sort of stunned by blackness into a kind of unanimated state, and then of course the black drape, which is about animation of this kind of body that you can't see, the kind of sort of animation or reanimation of that white skeleton. So my question really has to do with that. What's the relationship between animation and non-animation with regard to racial manipulation, if you like? I thought that was just fascinating.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I think really encapsulates some of the most important features of the modern, the contemporary artwork that interests me most. And are these, I mean, the Sandra Perry piece where these black dancers are effectively erased by artificial intelligence by design, right? It's not some terrible robot doing things from explicit races. It's being told to identify this content and erase it. And what we are left with is the white cube, right, which is the classical ideological space of modern contemporary art. And the white cube emerges out of the erasure of the black body. And this is a very and you can see it if you go online. You can actually see the pieces. They are the screens. I saw them recently at an amazing video art exhibition at MoMA, and they're large screens, very large screens. So the figures, if not life size, are close, and they are hauntingly beautiful. Now, the question that is, to my mind, completely and beautifully, powerfully unresolved in the piece is this sinister erasure or is this a liberatory erasure? Have these bodies been decimated in favor of the studio and the white cube, or have they escaped the surveillance of artificial intelligence and all kinds of other racist programs? And that undecidability between sinister and liberatory erasure is, to my mind, an essential place, because in so many respects, right, we want to be recognized, we want to be seen, we want to be known. And in so many other respects, we want to disappear, we want to move into the shadows, we want to not be known. We want to remain anonymous. And what work does darkness do? It clearly does both, right? And I think some of the best art today is able to recognize that the technology, both from a technological and from a racial perspective, it's that double-sidedness of the liberatory and oppressive potentials of erasure that have to be confronted in the work of art.
Thank you. That's really quite interesting, that tension. And I don't know if there's a resolution or that's the point of not resolving those shades in between. So that's a great point to further thought. Thank you.
And we have one more question by Caleb.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Yes, I did have one question, and it relates to what you're saying about sinister versus liberatory darkness. And I was wondering if you know, you're so much talking about on the oppressed community, and I wonder if it can be flipped onto like the surveillance state. And I'm thinking about how various technologies from like the antebellum slave narrative, you know, exposing the evil things that happen to like you know, people that have a cell phone that can capture like George Floyd's murder, you know, the different ways that light can uncover things in that way, but you know, it kind of be turned onto the oppressive regime in your art.
Yeah, great. And I'm gonna take this and you've flipped my presentation, and I want to flip it one more time and get to an even stranger place. And here I'm really relying on the work of a legal thinker and scholar, David Posen, who's done a lot of work on secrecy. And the liberatory Enlightenment model, of course, is using cell phones to document police brutality against oppressed minorities. That's the model we know. I think it's enormously important. It's almost inconceivable, right? For decades, the Black community has said, we were being oppressed by the police, and basically no one listened, right? No one outside of that community cared. When you video it and post those videos on YouTube, it becomes maybe one, maybe two, but one after another. I mean, it was like, at some point it just became undeniable. That's the anti-secrecy Enlightenment model that has been enormously powerful. But once again, I think we have to also recognize where the story flips, and that is around certain questions of secrecy. So Dave Posen, again, not looking at art, looking at legislature and law and whatnot, has demonstrated, I think pretty definitively, that at this point, the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, which is the big act that allows citizens to gain access to government files. And the whole point of this was that journalists would be able to uncover the truth and flip it on the surveillance state and surveil this for surveillance state and reveal the nefarious actors, et cetera. They've now, what he's uncovered is that almost anything worth finding out has been labeled top secret and therefore inaccessible via FOIA. And instead, FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, is being used by corporations to undermine the operations of democracy. And he gives an incredible example of progressive anti-gun legislation in the state of Florida after one of the massacre school shootings. And they held the vote in secret and passed the legislation. And people sued, and they forced a vote in public. And when voting in public, it failed because people weren't willing to stand up to the gun lobby in public. So here's an instance in which light enlightenment was weaponized by the right, by corporations, by the NRA, the National Rifle Association, in order to undermine democracy, in order to undermine progressive change. And he argues more broadly that what we have seen is a shift, or once upon a time, this type of anti-secrecy was considered liberatory and progressive, and it's basically now become reactionary and regressive in the specific case of U.S. legislatures. So absolutely, like the videos of police brutality, essential. Are police body cams working? I think that's a little bit that's debated, but certainly that impulse of forcing them to document their own behavior, compelling in principle. But I also just want to highlight that this can be, this anti-invisibility, anti-secrecy, etc., Enlightenment ideals can be weaponized as well. And we can't think that light and enlightenment is good and darkness and secrecy is bad. That's not going to work, but instead living with the complexity and recognizing that in each instance, secrecy and visibility can both be good or bad, which is a much more complex thing to live with. That's really, I think, the essential path moving forward.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. I think if we don't have any further questions, this was actually a very good reflection to wrap this up. And we're not going to steal any more time from you, even though this was absolutely entertaining as well. I mean, not only food for thoughts and nice, a nice insight into artificial darkness and your work, but it was also entertaining. So thank you very much again for your availability. Thank you for being with us today and to be the closing act of our conference. I think it was a very, very good way to close this. And thanks to all of our audience again, thanks to you for being here with us after so many hours of conference today and the whole week. And of course, thank you as well for your presentations that led up to the end of our conference. And have a lovely day, night, morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the great questions and insights. It really allows me to take the project forward.